got up early and left from downtown Port aux Basques. Dad asked if we wanted to ride up there, and I said, if I can't make it to the end of Port aux Basques, I'll never make it across the island. It was sunny at the start, even when we posed for pictures at the Railway Museum. It was nice, but as we rounded the corner to Grand Bay West, it grew overcast. At Long Grey, just past Edna's tea room, my rear fender lost a bolt. It was a key bolt that had kept the fender up on its post. Now the fender had sagged and was rubbing the tread on my Fatbike tire. I had to stop and fix it. It felt like a bad omen. Then, as we approached the sand dunes in Cheeseman's Provincial Park, the misty rain really started to come down. We had to stop again to don our rain shells, but that extra layer kept me warm and I continued on at my slow pace. I never really attempted to push myself more than 10 kilometers per hour the whole trip, despite being from Port aux Basques. I'd never taken this route to Cheeseman's Park before, but I recognized all the intersections that I frequented as a child growing up there. Before long, we're going through Cape Ray. The alders encroached here and the potholes are long, deep and muddy. Soon I was behind Sugarloaf Mountain and at the treacherous-looking cliffs at Red Rocks. No guardrails here. The trail seemed very long from Red Rocks along the cliffs overlooking the Gulf of St. Lawrence to McDougall's Bridge. There we stopped and ate an energy bar. The wind seemed to be in our faces. Then the trip seemed to speed up. It didn't seem long before we were going through the old defunct Mumachug Provincial Park. Next thing, to my surprise, we're stopping to take pictures at St. Andrew's Trestle. The journey up through Tompkins was very beautiful until we got to a curiously challenging hill near the TCH. I guess the upgrades to the TCH covered over the old rail line, and this bit of fill was put there in haste. Next, we're shopping for food at Mountainside General Store. We used to call it Walt Gales back in the 70s. Hasn't changed much since then. We got back on the trailway, and I was looking forward to seeing the Cowdery River, which I knew very well. My grandparents had a summer cottage in South Branch, and I spent my holidays there as a boy. The area around Overfalls was superb. The trailway widens into a first-class dirt road. This follows the Cowdery River right up to Mollychicknick Brook. At that point, the railway goes back to more of a narrow ballast path. Then we headed over a long bog. We passed Dan McIsaac's, and I anticipated South Branch, but we shot through South Branch rather quickly. It wasn't long before we were over the trestle there and up into another bog between North Branch and South Branch rivers. The familiar parts that I frequented as a boy went by in a flash. We passed a few houses at Wesley and over the trestle at North Branch. The view of North Branch River down over the bank on the right was beautiful. They took out the old overpass years ago, so the detour was not clearly marked and we got a little bit lost. We ended up on the TCH looking for a dirt road that would get us back on track. Luckily, I am familiar with the area. It wasn't too long before we found our way. The trailway is surprisingly close to the TCH here, and the approach to Cowdery Pond was spectacular. I couldn't take any pictures because my Pixel 4 was telling me that there was water in the charging port. Every time I looked at my phone, the battery was less and less. The trees here are very big, arguably the biggest on the trailway. Cowdery Pond was also very long. By this point, the sun was back out in full and we're getting pretty warm. The track follows a big turn toward the left and we went under the TCH. Then we started climbing and I got quite slow and tired. But eventually the elevation leveled out and we started our descent into Loch Leven. This was all new to me. I didn't know about this deep valley or where we might emerge, but emerge we did at Loch Leven. And despite showing only 2% battery capacity, I had to take a few pictures. I didn't care anymore. We pushed on in the evening sun, passing St. Fintan's, Crabs River, and finally pitching our tent right down in Middle Barishwa Brook. I couldn't believe that I'd covered such a distance and that I'd started in Port aux Basques that morning. The next day started nice. It was fun to explore the little communities in our approach to Robinson's River. I always found that area beautiful, but before long we were climbing. We also came across a long flooded section that proved to be the worst of the entire journey. My biking buddy filmed me through this.
All right. Got it.
And there were just bogs and barrens that went on forever. Eventually, the track reaches a high point where there's a skidoo warm-up shelter, and then the track descends into black spruce. This section seemed to go on forever. Not as scenic as the previous day. Very few signs posted. It's all too easy to confuse the trailway with woods roads in this section. Then we seemed to encounter a Groundhog Day section. There'd be a large pond to our left, a slight left turn and a rise. That happened 3 times. I was getting tired for something new. I found out later that these ponds were called Big Rushy Pond, Flat Bay Pond. Then suddenly we're crossing Flat Bay Road. Next it was Flat Bay Brook Bridge, and finally we get to the houses in St. George's. My biking buddy uses his phone to find a spot to buy lunch, and we pick up sandwiches and wraps and desserts at Central Service Station on Main Street in St. George's. From there it gets a little bit more interesting and approaches Stephenville Crossing. I like seeing Mattis Point and the bottom of Bay St. George. Bicycling through Stephenville Crossing was busy. It was a warm day and there was traffic and pedestrians moving about. But that was short-lived, and we were back into the bogs and barrens again. This went on for ages. We eventually arrived at some sparse cabins seemingly in the middle of nowhere. My buddy struck up a conversation with a man who told us that scenery was going to improve as we headed further east. It did improve in a way. There were more trees, but the going seemed to get rougher. At one point the ballast had washed away, leaving just large beach rocks that were even a challenge for my Fatbike tires. Then it suddenly became a sensible dirt road, good enough for a regular car, and the trees got really big. I glanced to my right and saw a river. Was this Harry's River? Yes, it was. We were getting close to Glance and George's Lake. There was a logging operation around Glance, so the road's in great shape. But on the other side of Glance, it got rough again and dark. We passed a few salmon fishermen, and then we're out to George's Lake. The lake is way bigger than I expected and took ages to bicycle the length of it. We're getting tired, but my buddy kept going, and we found a high spot north of the lake to pitch the tent. It was the first time I crawled into my sleeping bag without getting a bath first. I was packed a little faster than my buddy, and so I waited patiently, taking in the morning summer air and wondering what views I would take in that day. As soon as my buddy joined me, I took off with surprising energy. The descent was surprisingly steep, especially given that the old Victorians tried their best to have a shallow grade up or down. We stopped briefly on our way down at a wonderfully clear brook to fill our water bottles, and then we shot on again. Visually, it felt like I was going up after the brook, but all the charts tell me otherwise. Actually, my speed should have also been an indicator that it was all downhill past Cook's Pond, Little Cook's Pond, and into Mount Moriah. The trailway then gets sketchy as it works through Curling into Corner Brook and up the Humber Valley. This is the worst spot on the entire trail for it being covered up, paved over, or claimed by aggressive developers. We take a slight detour to Tim Hortons on the Valley Mall parking lot for a second breakfast. It's always good to feed your body when exerting it so much with long hours of bicycling. We stop briefly at the train display in Humbermouth and continue on the TCH. We stay on the TCH until the overpass at Humber Village between Steady Brook and Little Rapids. Then there's a dirt bike trail adjacent to the TCH on the right that eventually takes us through Little Rapids. Then we pass under an overpass onto a dirt road at Boom Siding. That dirt road goes all the way to Pasadena, which we ride through. This section was the old Trans-Canada Highway back in the 1980s. At the end of Pasadena, we go under yet another overpass at the intersection there, and the trailway emerges once again. However, this section was really overgrown. It isn't until later in the summer that someone clears the encroaching alders and grades it. All I remember of this section at the time are just 2 deep trenches and alders hitting me. It seems to go on forever, and given my fatigue, even slight inclines feel exhausting to pedal. We get up to a quarry and I snap a picture of a brave little fox sunning and grooming himself. From there, I take a wrong turn and head into a cul-de-sac at the end of Taylor Estates. I make my way out of it and back into familiar territory towards St. Jude's. We cross back under the TCH and I'm back home in Deer Lake. It rains the next day, Thursday, and so we hunker down at the house to recuperate. We start out early as usual, and my spirits are quite high as I know at least 50% of the journey today, and I know my biking buddy will appreciate the sights. I talk a lot this morning, sharing my local knowledge, although my familiarity with this area only goes back a few months. It's generally a climb heading out of Deer Lake. It doesn't level off until you reach Northern, an old siding near the canal intake. My buddy has never seen the 1925 main dam and stops to take pictures down in Junction Brook looking up at the dam. We push our bikes up out of the gorge and head toward Howley. That section is mostly bog until you get down close to Grand Lake, where it gets more scenic and sandy. In fact, there's about 200 meters of sand that you cannot pedal through, so we end up pushing our bikes for a second time that morning. We continue on through Howley, and then the long, boring section of very straight trailway through the boreal forest. That's a nearly 20-kilometer section that has almost no distinguishing features, just track and trees. But then there are a couple of bends in the road, and the land drops away to our left as we climb into Kitty's Brook. Kitty's Brook is just magical. It's a tight little valley with mountain ridges seemingly within arm's reach. It feels like you're in a movie set. It's so quaint and picturesque, and it has such a variety in foliage. I guess it's why they call it a microclimate. It certainly doesn't seem to get much wind, as it feels very sheltered. We chat briefly to two couples on their quads and side-by-sides who ask us where we've come from and where we're headed at the first trestle. At the second trestle, what's known as Kitty's East, we stop at a natural spring for lunch. This was a great idea. It was now midday and we're halfway to Millertown Junction, and it was the end of my knowledge. I hadn't been in this area since riding the train for real back in the late 1970s. We took our time to eat, boil water for coffee. I quite enjoyed the second part of the day. The incline seemed less pronounced. We winded our way up past the chain lakes, and I picked up a railway spike here as a souvenir of my trailway adventure. The terrain gradually transforms into barrens, and later there are a few cabins at Pond Crossing, and further again, more cabins at Gaff Topsail. The actual tolt of Gaff Topsail is a pronounced bald hill pushing out of the barrens. The tolt is visible from quite a distance on the approach, and you seem to come at it from the back. The trail feels like it bends slightly to the right, so then you can see the front of the gaff too. Strangers pass us here on their ATVs, and the section's quite straight. We pass a sign that reads Summit with some details in elevation and distance to St. John's. We pass a place called Quarry, where they cut the massive granite stones for many of the trestle supports for all the streams and rivers along the way. Then the trail descends slightly. We pass Mary March River, and the surrounding gets more trees. Then there's an incredibly long, straight section on approach to Millertown Junction. The trees continue to grow in size and it eventually takes us into cabin country and Joe Glode's Pond. Too tired to pitch our tent, I volunteer to walk up to the Junction Lodge and I tap on their door. I have to do this a couple of times to get some attention. Through a bit of a delay, the operator agrees to put us up for the night, $30 each. We agreed to the offer. Turns out to be owned by Mont Lingard, the writer of the Next Stop series of books on the Newfoundland Railway. We're able to get a good shower and a cozy bed for the night. We were up very early the next day, out the door onto the trailway by 6:30. It was a morning mist and a low sun that made it picture perfect. We headed off to Badger, which was not a long trek at all. The trail sticks very close to the TCH after that, and we could stop along the way knowing exactly where we were. Then there's no distance to Grand Falls-Windsor. There's another overpass and you end up on the left of the TCH. We navigate the subway in Windsor for lunch. After Windsor, it's not too long to Bishop's Falls. They have some rolling stock on display there, much of it damaged by vandals. Bishop's is home to the longest trestle on the island, which stretches across the Exploits River. You go through another overpass shortly after Bishop's, and you're out into the Bay of Exploits. This section was very pretty. Some very large trees here, but it was hot and seemed to take some time. We chose to pitch our tent at an abandoned park called Rattling Brook. I managed to get a bath in this brook before I crawled into my tent for the night. The flies were extra bad here. Mosquitoes really enjoyed my ankles for some reason. Day 6 was a shorter day. Dion had agreed to pick us up at Gander so that we could get a motel room in Glovertown and rest for the next day. For some reason it seemed to be very slow going out of Nora's Arm. The wind seemed to be in our face and it felt like you were going uphill, although the conditions were dry. It wasn't too long before we were in Glenwood for a snack at Johnny's place. Appleton is just beyond Glenwood. There's another overpass and a long stretch before you pull into Gander. Riding through Gander was quite nice. The town has the trailway paved and it's very manicured there. The trailway disappears as it's paved over at the Walmart parking lot. We stopped to eat again, this time at Little Caesars. Dion picked us up in the 4Runner and we drove to Glovertown for 2 nights. We explored the Eastport Peninsula and took some lovely pictures of salvage. Everyone there has their fishing stages painted red. I haven't seen such color coordination in Newfoundland Outport before. The motel didn't have laundry facilities. We were forced to wash in the shower and hang to dry in the small rooms there. I assume it involved COVID-19 restrictions. So we were a bit late getting packed and into the 4Runner to head back to Gander parking lot to resume where we'd finished. It was here that I took a rare video of myself pedaling.
Just leaving Gander. Next stop, I guess, is Benton. And then Gambo River.
It was slightly downhill from Gander to Benton, and there was a lovely spring on the way. Benton was a very tidy, quaint little town. I love the work the locals put into their lawns. Next we were into some mixed woods, both deciduous and conifer trees are quite large. Then we passed several large ponds such as Butts, Dark Cove, and Goose Pond. Then we rounded a corner and we were into Gambo. No hills. The railway passes all the hills that the TCH climbs and descends. We stopped for an early lunch at a mobile takeaway that was parked right in the owner's driveway. It's not evident from the highway, but as soon as the trailway turns to line up with the trestle in Gambo, the trail hits perfectly straight for kilometers. The trailway goes under the TCH shortly after you leave Gambo. You're into a place called Grants. I took some pictures here of ferns. Then the trailway gets a bit loopy on approach to Terra. I imagine it was difficult for the Victorians back in the late 1890s to chart a course through these rolling hills and try to maintain a relatively level track, hence the abundance of turns in this area. I bicycled past Bosun Pond and Mackles Lake. It was here that a piece of ballast was picked up by my heavily treaded Fatbike tire and got firmly lodged between my tire and frame. The sharp elongated rock cut like a dull knife through both my tire and inner tube. I heard and felt the air leak out of my rear tire. I was gutted. I unpacked my gear and I did my best to make repairs. The peel and stick patches are wonderful on inner tubes and are still holding up months later as I make this video. But the tire! How do I patch a tire? It was like a 4-centimeter tear on the outside. I had ordered 3 replacement tires from Amazon, but they were still in transit from Spain somewhere over the North Atlantic according to the tracking info online. I put everything back together and inflated the inner tube as much as I dared, but the inner tube bulged out of the elongated tear in the outer tire. And it was so slow going. It was torture. And my spirits had been deflated. I didn't want to do this anymore. It was the sword of Damocles. I didn't know when this repair was going to fail again, and it felt imminent. I approached Terra very slowly. My biking buddy was very patient with me. When I got to the picnic table at the dep in Terra, he offered to sew the tire. But my heart wasn't in it anymore. Dion came and got me, and I thought that was the end of my trailway track across the island. I was pretty amazed that I got from Portabas to Terra on my own accord. That itself was an accomplishment. My biking buddy decided to press on, so I packed up the fat bike and I left it all half-heartedly. Coincidentally, my Amazon tires arrived at my house in Deer Lake that same day. My other friend from Reedville, who was checking my mail, picked up the package and got it to me on DRL coach lines the next day. By the second day, I'd pedaled on another bicycle out to Paradise, DRL Depot, and got my tires. I was back in business. I was 2 days behind my biking buddy. He had continued on solo and had stopped at Briggs Junction. I could make repairs and be out there to meet him at 6 a.m. in the morning. I was a little late in getting out to Briggs Junction. I may have been 30-40 minutes late. Dion, my wife, was very good in fetching me and dropping me off at these various points. I was really hoping to meet up with my biking buddy at Briggs Junction, but I got turned around. Called Briggs Junction for a reason. It was the branch line out at Conception Bay North. So, when I came south from the TCH, I continued on the slow turn, heading west. I was about 6 kilometers before I realized the sun was at my back. That's curious, I thought. I checked my Pixel 4, Google Maps. It was now showing I was 75 kilometers from St. John's instead of 69. Frustrated that I had missed my rendezvous with my buddy and very mad at myself for such a stupid navigational error, I quickly turned around. Even more unsettling is that I began to not recognize the trail I'd just bicycled down. I'd inadvertently passed Briggs Junction and was now going under the overpass on the TCH. At least I knew I was going in the right direction now. It was very flat on approach to Avondale, and I was surprised at the kilometer or so of narrow gauge track that's still there, just west of Avondale. How they managed to keep that length of track, I don't know. But soon I was into that descending switchback at Holyrood and down near the Landwash. I love going by all the marinas there. It was a long stretch going up toward Holyrood Thermal Generation Plant, but the scenery was stunningly beautiful. I had resigned to the idea that I was ever going to finish with my biking buddies, so I tried to slow down and enjoy it. I even went to A&W Manuals for a burger. The approach to St. John's was all new to me until I got to Topsails Pond. I had been there last summer before they had upgraded the trail. Back then, there was still the original round beach rock the railway used as ballast. It was just torture back then to plow through on pedal bike. Now it was luxurious. They have a great job done. The sides are manicured and the P-stone perfect for bicycling. I met up with close friends on the other side of Bowring Park, and my biking buddy had waited at the train display in downtown St. John's to greet me. That was a pretty good ending. There's just one remaining question. would I ever finish the gap from Terra to Briggs Junction. July passed, August was nearly over, and I had agreed to host friends of mine from Nova Scotia at the end of summer heading into my deferred salary year. It didn't look like any opportunity would present itself for me to finish the missing gap. Soon Dion would be back at school and I would even lose my support. My Nova Scotia friends did show up and I got into the hosting mode. But, as luck would have it, they wanted some time to explore central Newfoundland. That was all I needed too. Just a few days and I could finish what my shredded tire wouldn't allow weeks earlier. Dion agreed to drop me off at the Dep in Terra. It's a bit of a drive from Deer Lake to Terra in a Forerunner. Even at highway speeds, it's nearly 4 hours. So I was slow getting started. I was also a little nervous camping by myself in wild Newfoundland outdoors in my little tent, but it did feel good to be back on the trail. There's a long stretch of Barren that's fairly straight, but a slight climb out of Terra. But then it's all downhill and you're into familiar territory near the TCH and Port Blandford. It was great to read their historical posts and venture over the trestle there. I knew the trailway went parallel to the TCH here, and I also knew by the overpass at Thorburn Lake. I hadn't been on the other side of Thorburn Lake though, and I hadn't realized how beautiful it was to venture so close to the hills west of Clarenville. Going through Clarenville was absolutely lovely. I was surprised at where the trailway exits Clarenville. It seems to head straight for a cliff, turns sharply to the left, goes up a narrow, dark valley, and goes under a very hidden overpass. From there, it climbs up and up into an increasing number of bogs, and the trail eventually levels out. There are a few very new, very fancy cabins in this area. It started getting dark. I'd started late, so I'd only completed just over 60 kilometers before I pitched my tent and went to sleep somewhere adjacent to 80 Town, but, over several hills. I had a surprisingly great sleep. I got up, had a wonderful MRE breakfast, mixed berry cobbler and Pop-Tart, tons of carbs to feed my muscles. As with any day on this entire trek, I had no idea where I'd be camping that night or how far I'd get that day. There was one spot that opened up into a valley with a couple of cabins. I couldn't see the highway, but I could hear transport trucks gearing in the distance. Other than that, the approach to Gooby seemed dark and old. The few cabins along the way seemed to be in disrepair. But Gooby's itself was lovely. You go on the inside of a long pond, and the other side, Gooby Station, on the maps, has a river suitable for drinking. Then the trailway winds its way along the side of a hill that increasingly becomes a bigger and bigger valley. This is called Glenview, and it ends with an outstanding vista of Come By Chance Gut. You'll also get to see Muskrat Falls power lines and a new road they've installed in the valley with the new Bailey Bridge way down below. The trail turns sharply to the left, and suddenly you're in the community of Come By Chance. Then you get to see the old refinery, and you're through an overpass at Arnold's Cove, and you're climbing. You get very close to the TCH in some high country, and you go under another overpass as you approach Little Harbor and Rantham Station. It was somewhat scenic going through the Doe Hills, but then the trailway departs from the TCH, and you head in a more southerly route toward Placentia Junction. It's just bogs and barrens again. I pedaled on without having lunch. I did stop briefly to have a powdered breakfast replacement and some water, which was very refreshing. The cabins are very creepy in this area. The old school buses with bright paint and wooden additions tacked on do not look inviting. I was also getting tired. When you're tired, you don't notice the downhill parts, but the slight uphill parts slow you down and ache your joints. I could feel the sun setting at Placentia Junction, and for some strange reason I got a burst of energy, so I texted Dion and I asked for her to pick me up at Briggs Junction. It didn't seem long before I was at an overpass on Route 100 and approaching Whitburn. I saw some teens trespassing on the train display there. Now the sun was setting, and it would soon be dark. I was going to press on with just my small LED headlamp. I'd covered a section of this weeks earlier when I got turned around at Briggs Junction and felt that I wasn't missing anything by finishing in the dark. I got to Dion at 11 p.m. that night at Briggs Junction, having done about 2 or 3 hours in the dark. It was satisfying to end my 883 kilometer trek across the island.